Aurora had been alone for 642 days when she stopped counting. The numbers no longer mattered because time moved differently on Kepler-7. The planet's rotation was slower than Earth's, so each day stretched longer, and each night brought a sky filled with stars that did not match the constellations she had memorized in childhood. She lived in the old human research station on the Eastern Plateau, a place of concrete and steel that now felt more like a tomb than a home. The station had been designed for 100 researchers, but now only Aurora remained. The others had either left on ships that never returned, or they had abandoned the mission to join the attempted colony on the western continent. Those people had stopped responding to communications 3 years ago. Aurora spent her days maintaining the station's systems, not because it was necessary, but because it gave her something to do. She cleaned the solar panels even though they were still pristine. She organized the storage rooms though nothing ever went missing. She prepared meals for one person in a kitchen, designed to feed entire teams. These rituals kept her sane, or at least kept her from thinking too much about the silence. The communication array was the most important part of her routine. Every morning she checked it for incoming messages. Every evening she broadcast her position to the stars, hoping that anyone would hear. She knew the odds were terrible. The ships that were supposed to rescue her had likely encountered problems in deep space. Space was vast enough to swallow civilizations without a trace. But Aurora had trained for this. She was a xenolinguist and a trained survival specialist. She knew how to maintain equipment, how to grow food in the hydroponic gardens, how to repair systems when they failed. She had enough supplies in storage to last for years. She had electricity from the solar panels and the station's backup fusion reactor. Theoretically, she could survive here indefinitely. The problem was not survival. The problem was meaning. She had spent the first year trying to conduct her original research. She studied the native fauna and flora of Kepler-7. She documented the geological formations and the weather patterns. She wrote detailed reports about everything she observed, and she stored these reports in the station's database knowing that probably no human would ever read them. In the second year, she tried to expand her research. She ventured further from the station. Exploring the valleys and canyons that surrounded the plateau, she found evidence of settlements, ancient ruins that suggested an intelligent civilization had existed on Kepler-7 long ago. The architecture was unlike anything designed by human hands. The buildings seemed to grow organically from the landscape, as if they had been coaxed into existence rather than constructed. She found texts carved into stone, written in a language that did not match any of the samples she had studied. She filled journals with drawings and photographs, trying to decipher meaning from the symbols. Some of them appeared to be mathematical in nature, others looked more like art. A few seemed to be warnings, though she could not understand against what danger they cautioned. The third year brought the accident Aurora had been exploring, the lower caves on the southern side of the mountain range. When the tremor occurred, she had not known the region was geologically active. The cave ceiling had collapsed, trapping her in a chamber where stalactites hung like teeth and the air grew thin. She had been injured badly. A section of rock had crushed her left leg, and her ribs were broken. Bleeding and in agony, she had dragged herself into a smaller chamber, thinking that it would be a place to die. She had no way to call for help. Her communication device had been destroyed in the collapse. She remembered the pain with perfect clarity. She remembered lying on the cold stone floor and thinking that this was how it would end. Alone on an alien world in the dark with no one to ever know she had existed. She remembered hoping her death would be quick. She did not remember when the eyes first appeared in the darkness. The creature that approached her was enormous. Even in her pain and confusion, Aurora could see that. The eyes were large and luminous, glowing with an inner light that seemed warm somehow, not threatening. The creature made a sound that was not quite a roar and not quite a purr. It was something in between, a vibration that she felt in her bones. Aurora should have been terrified. She should have tried to fight or run. Instead, she felt something shift inside her mind. It was as if the creature's voice was not trying to harm her, but to communicate something beyond words. It was trying to tell her that she was not alone. It was trying to tell her that she would not die in this cave. The dragons had found her then. She learned later that there were two of them, though in her injured state she had not been able to distinguish between them clearly. They had come to the caves for reasons she did not understand. Perhaps they had sensed her presence. Perhaps they had been hunting something else and simply encountered her by accident. What mattered was that instead of treating her as prey, they treated her as a patient. They used their fire carefully, warming her without burning her. They brought her water from an underground spring, letting the liquid flow into her mouth. They lay against her, sharing their body heat through the coldest part of the night. When Aurora's fever came, they did something that defied explanation. They touched her with their snouts, and her pain seemed to flow out of her body into theirs. They made the vibrating sound again, and her wounds began to heal, not all at once but faster than seemed medically possible. Flesh knitted together, bones realigned. Within days she could move again. It was only after she had recovered that Aurora realized these were not creatures. They were dragons. They were sapient. They were intelligent in ways that human science had not documented. They were also, she would come to understand, the last members of a dying species on a world that was slowly forgetting them. The dragons led her out of the caves when she was strong enough to walk. They moved through passages that did not seem to follow any logical geography, taking turns that defied the architecture Aurora's mind tried to map. Eventually, they emerged into a vast underground cathedral, a chamber so enormous that its ceiling disappeared into darkness beyond even the dragon's luminescence. In this chamber, she saw the ruins of a civilization, not the ancient human-built ruins from the surface, but something older, something that predated human exploration of the cosmos. Structures of crystal and stone rose in impossible geometries. Water cascaded down walls that seemed to reflect light from no obvious source. The air was warm and clean, cycled by vents in the rock that suggested ancient engineering. The dragons led her to a structure that looked almost like a nest, hollowed into the living rock and lined with soft materials. They indicated with gestures and thought patterns that she should rest here. They brought her food, fruits and vegetables that she had never seen before but which she would come to depend on. They remained nearby, watching over her with those luminous eyes that seemed to hold all the secrets of Kepler-7. It was in this underground sanctuary that Aurora began her true life on this alien world. The station on the plateau seemed very far away suddenly, as if that part of her existence had belonged to someone else entirely. She was no longer a human explorer studying an alien world. She was something new, something that did not yet have a name. The dragons would teach her what she was becoming over the long years that followed. The first dragon's name was Ember, though Aurora did not learn this all at once. Names on Kepler-7 were not simple sounds or labels. They were concepts, feelings and images strung together into something that approximated language. When the dragon showed her his name, she felt warmth and remembered fire. She saw golden light reflecting off crystal surfaces. She experienced the sensation of flight through clouds at sunset. All of these things combined meant Ember. The second dragon took longer to introduce herself. She was more cautious, more reserved. Her thoughts moved like flowing water rather than burning flame. When she finally shared her name, Aurora received visions of things smooth and reflective. She saw light bent through geometric patterns. She felt calm and deep peace. The name was Crystal. Communicating with the dragons was not like learning a human language. It was not about memorizing words or grammar rules. It was about opening her mind to a form of consciousness that worked differently than human thinking. At first, Aurora had resisted it. Her scientific training told her that this should be impossible, that telepathy was pseudoscience, that her mind was just interpreting the dragon's behavior in familiar patterns. But resistance only caused confusion and pain. It was like trying to hear someone speaking underwater while wearing headphones. The more she relaxed and accepted the strange new sense, the clearer everything became. Ember taught her first. He showed her how to understand the sensations coming from his mind and translate them into images she could recognize. He would think of a concept, and she would experience it in multiple forms simultaneously. She would see it as colors, hear it as music, feel it as physical sensations, and understand it all as a unified whole. It was overwhelming at first, but gradually, her human brain learned to process information in this new way. The dragons showed her around their sanctuary carefully, as if she were fragile and might break. They taught her which fruits were safe to eat and which were poisonous. They showed her where fresh water collected in natural pools. They introduced her to other creatures that shared the underground realm, small animals that Aurora's mind tried to categorize as insects or rodents, but which were actually something entirely different from anything that lived on Earth. Gradually, Aurora began to understand the nature of the ruins around her. The dragons were not simply living in an old city. They were maintaining it. They had developed a system of care for the structures, using methods that combined what might be called agriculture with what might be called architecture. They cultivated materials from the stone itself, coaxing crystals to grow in specific directions to create tools and light sources. They managed water to flow through channels that served both practical and ceremonial purposes. The dragons taught her the history of their civilization, or at least their understanding of it. Centuries ago, before human space exploration, Kepler-7 had been home to a vast network of dragon settlements spread across the planet. The dragons had achieved a level of technological sophistication that rivaled human achievement, but they had chosen a different path. Instead of expanding outward and dominating other worlds, they had gone inward, developing their mental capabilities and their connection to their environment. Then humans arrived. The first contact had been peaceful. The dragons and humans had tried to communicate, but the language barrier had been absolute. Humans saw dragons and thought of them as dangerous animals. Dragons saw humans and sensed their hunger for conquest. Misunderstandings led to conflicts. Conflicts led to violence. A plague had come next, one that affected dragons far more severely than humans. The humans believed they had nothing to do with it, but the dragons detected pathogens in human technology, microscopic organisms that human travelers had inadvertently brought from distant worlds. The plague had killed 90% of the dragon population on Kepler-7 in just a few years. The survivors had retreated underground, cutting themselves off from human contact. They sealed the lower levels of their cities and went deep into the earth where humans could not easily follow. They had lived in isolation for 200 human years, watching the human colony fail and disappear, waiting for the day when humans would return. Ember and Crystal were among the last dragons alive on Kepler-7. Perhaps fewer than 100 remained, scattered across different underground settlements unable to reproduce at population-sustaining rates. They were a species in its final stages of extinction. Aurora felt this truth deeply when the dragons shared it with her. She wept, understanding the tragedy of what she was witnessing. These magnificent beings, sapient and sophisticated, were dying out not because of any flaw in themselves, but because of circumstances beyond their control. The dragons did not seem to mourn. Their minds worked differently. They had accepted this fate as they had accepted all things, with a kind of philosophical resignation mixed with stubborn determination, to live out their remaining years with purpose. They showed Aurora their library next. It was not a building but a cavern, and instead of books it contained something more remarkable. The dragons had preserved their knowledge in a form that transcended paper or digital storage. The walls themselves seemed to contain information. Patterns carved into the stone held meaning that could be read through a combination of visual interpretation and mental contact. Aurora spent weeks learning how to read these walls. At first, she could only grasp fragments. Individual concepts would float into her mind like leaves on wind. Gradually, she learned to read longer passages, to hold multiple meanings in her consciousness simultaneously. The dragon's written knowledge covered everything from practical survival information to philosophy to art to mathematics. She discovered that the dragons understood the universe in ways that human science was only beginning to comprehend. They had documented the nature of quantum entanglement. They had theories about dark matter and dark energy that aligned with contemporary human physics, but went far deeper. They understood the fundamental structure of reality in ways that seemed to combine mathematics with something that could only be described as spiritual insight. One particular text caught Aurora's attention. It was a prophecy or a prediction, written in language that was difficult to parse even with the dragon's help. It spoke of a convergence, a time when two species would meet and be transformed by each other. It spoke of a guardian who would stand between worlds and choose the path of enlightenment over the path of conquest. When she asked Ember about this text, the dragon's response carried overtones of significance. She sensed that this prophecy was important to him, that it had meaning beyond historical interest. Ember showed her visions of what this prophecy might mean. In his mind, she saw images of herself standing between two groups, one human and one dragon, and she saw the future splitting into multiple possibilities based on choices she had not yet made. Aurora wanted to ask more questions, but the effort of maintaining deep telepathic communication was exhausting. She had learned that merging her consciousness with the dragon's minds required immense concentration and left her drained afterward. She had taken many long rests during her time in the sanctuary. The dragons seemed to understand her limitations. They did not push her beyond what she could bear. Instead, they created a life for her that allowed for both communication and solitude. They showed her a smaller chamber within their sanctuary, where she could rest and be alone when she needed it. They taught her how to work with the crystal structures and stone to create her own space. Over months and then years, Aurora stopped feeling like a visitor to the sanctuary. She began to feel like a resident, even a member of the dragon community. She learned their routines and rhythms. She participated in their daily practices of maintaining the structures and cultivating their food sources. She joined them in activities that had no practical purpose, but served something spiritual. Journeys through the deepest parts of the underground realm, where they simply existed together in companionable silence. And gradually, something began to change in her biology and her mind. She was not becoming a dragon, but she was not remaining purely human either. The constant exposure to the dragon's telepathic presence was rewiring her neural pathways. Her eyes grew more sensitive to light. Her hearing became acute enough to detect frequencies that normal humans could not process. Her skin developed a subtle luminescence that matched the dragon's own bioluminescent patterns. Ember and Crystal watched this transformation with interest but without concern. When Aurora questioned what was happening to her, they sent her visions of other humans from their history who had bonded with dragons. Not many, but a few. These humans had undergone similar changes. They had become something new. A bridge between two species, able to function in both human and dragon societies. Aurora understood then that her stranding on Kepler-7 was not an accident. It was not a failure of her rescue mission, or a tragedy of bad luck. It was a meeting of destiny and circumstance, a convergence that the dragons had perhaps foreseen and allowed to happen. She was being transformed into something the universe needed her to be. 5 years had passed since Aurora first descended into the underground sanctuary. 5 years of learning, of growing, of slowly transforming into something that existed between human and dragon. She had not left the mountain range once in all that time. The world above had become almost abstract to her, remembered through stories and old memories rather than lived experience. She maintained a small connection to the station, though she no longer lived there. Every few months, she would venture back to the plateau and check the communications array. It was a ritual more than a necessity. She had long abandoned hope of rescue. The silence from the stars had been too absolute for too long. Either humanity had forgotten about Kepler-7, or they had encountered catastrophic problems that prevented them from returning. Either way, her life was now here, with Ember and Crystal and the other underground dwellers she had come to know. The other dragons were few in number. In the settlement that Amber and Crystal called home, there were only 18 of them remaining. There were other settlements deeper in the earth, communities that had survived the plague in isolation, but overall the dragon population on Kepler-7 numbered in the hundreds at most. Ember had explained to her that at their current reproduction rate, the species would be extinct within a few hundred human years. It was not a tragedy to them. It was simply a fact, a natural arc of existence that had to be accepted. Aurora had learned to live with this acceptance. Her human mind still resisted the idea of an entire species disappearing from existence. But her dragon-touched consciousness understood that all things ended. Even civilizations, even worlds. The universe cycled between creation and dissolution, and clinging to permanence was futile. The seasons changed on Kepler-7 just as they did on Earth, though the cycles were longer and the variations subtler. Aurora had watched the landscape transform 4 complete times, had seen the plants shift through their growth phases, had watched the creatures of the underground sanctuary prepare for dormancy and awakening. It was during the 5th winter's arrival when the signal came. Aurora was working with Crystal in the crystal garden, tending to the luminescent structures that grew naturally in the deeper chambers. These crystals provided light and were vital to the sanctuary's functioning. They also played a role in the dragon's communication systems, somehow amplifying or channeling their telepathic broadcasts. Crystal suddenly stopped what she was doing. Her mind reached out to Aurora with urgency, pulling her attention away from the work. The dragon was receiving a signal from somewhere distant, something that took effort to interpret. Aurora could feel Crystal's strain as she attempted to understand the meaning. Then Crystal shared what she was receiving with Aurora, and everything changed. A signal. A human signal, coming from deep space, not from Kepler-7, but from the region where the colony ships would approach the planet. The signal was fragmentary and broken, repeated on continuous loop, but the meaning was unmistakable. Humans were coming. The colony ships were finally returning to Kepler-7 after all these years. Ember appeared moments later, drawn by Crystal's emotional broadcast. Both dragons seemed to struggle with the information. They conferred with each other in ways that Aurora could partially sense but not fully understand. Their minds moved too fast, making connections and extrapolating possibilities at speeds that her hybrid human consciousness could not match. Finally, they turned to Aurora and shared their thoughts with her. They had known this was coming eventually. They had spoken of it during the long years of her stay, explaining that the prophecy mentioned the return of humans to Kepler-7. They had discussed possibilities and prepared mentally for this event. But now that the signal was real, now that the return was imminent, the weight of it seemed immense. The remaining dragons across all the settlements had begun to receive the signal through the crystal network. Aurora could sense the disturbance in the mental landscape that the dragons inhabited. She felt currents of fear and uncertainty, but also curiosity and something that might have been hope. Ember and Crystal led Aurora to the central chamber of their sanctuary, a place she had not visited before. It was the most sacred space in the underground settlement, a chamber where ancient crystals reached from floor to ceiling like a forest of stone. The two dragons explained that this was where the most important decisions were made, where the community consciousness could gather and think as one. Over the following days, Aurora participated in a kind of council. Dragons from other nearby settlements traveled through the underground passages to join the gathering. They met in the crystal chamber, and together they contemplated what the return of humanity meant. Through the dragons' discussion, Aurora began to understand the weight of her own position. She was, as far as anyone knew, the only human-dragon hybrid on Kepler-7. She was fluent in both languages, able to think in both frameworks. She understood human nature because she was human. She understood dragon nature because she was becoming dragon. She was uniquely positioned to be a bridge between the two species. The dragons did not ask her directly what she wanted to do. They did not demand that she choose a side. Instead, they showed her the different possibilities that her choice would create. In one vision, Aurora turned away from the returning humans. She remained with the dragons and kept their existence secret. The human colony would expand, but it would discover no evidence of intelligent native life. Eventually, human civilization would establish itself on Kepler-7, and the dragons would retreat further underground, living in isolation until they eventually went extinct. In this timeline, humans would transform Kepler-7 into a human world, and the dragons would fade into legend and myth. In another vision, Aurora went to meet the returning humans as a human. She returned to her own people and attempted to convince them that the dragons were intelligent and worthy of protection. Some humans would listen, but others would see the dragons only as obstacles to colonization. There would be conflict. The dragons, weakened by plague and time, would suffer greatly. Some humans might die too. The outcome was uncertain, but it would involve suffering and loss. There were other possibilities too. Timelines where treaties failed. Timelines where dragons and humans successfully coexisted. Timelines where one species conquered the other. Each timeline branched into further possibilities, creating a tree of futures that grew too complex to fully comprehend. But there was one vision that both Ember and Crystal kept returning to, a possibility that seemed to call to them with particular intensity. In this future, a human woman stood at the boundary between two worlds. She was transformed, carrying dragon magic in her very cells, bearing the understanding of both species in her consciousness. This woman opened a path of cooperation and learning. She was not human and she was not dragon, but something new entirely. And in her transformation and her choice, both species found a way to become something greater than they could be alone. Aurora realized with the start that the woman in the vision was her. The dragons did not demand that she accept this role, but they made it clear that they had invested in her transformation for a reason. They had not saved her life simply out of compassion, though that had been part of it. They had been preparing her for a moment that was now approaching. She had time to prepare. The colony ships would take weeks to arrive, even at faster than light speeds. The signal had been sent months ago. They were not yet at Kepler-7, but they were coming. For the first time since she had arrived at the sanctuary, Aurora felt the pull of her human past calling to her. She began to think of the station on the plateau. She began to remember what Earth felt like. She recalled the voices of other humans, the taste of human food, the smell of human civilization. She had spent 5 years becoming something else. Now she would have to choose who she would be when the humans returned. Aurora spent weeks preparing for the arrival of the human ships. She traveled back to the plateau station for the first time in 5 years and found it exactly as she had left it. The vegetation she had cultivated in the hydroponic gardens had died without her care. The solar panels were still functioning, maintaining the station's backup systems. The communications array was intact and waiting. She activated the main terminal and accessed the historical records of her time on Kepler-7. She reviewed her old research data, her logs about the weather patterns and geological surveys. It felt like reading someone else's diary, the perspective of a woman who no longer existed. That Aurora had been purely human, young and optimistic about the mission of exploring alien worlds. This Aurora was something else entirely. The communication signal became clearer as the weeks passed. She was able to piece together more information about the returning mission. It appeared to be a true colony expedition, not just a rescue mission. There were 17 massive ships in the flotilla, each carrying thousands of colonists and vast amounts of equipment. They were coming to establish a permanent human presence on Kepler-7. According to the fragmented messages, the delay in returning was due to problems with the faster-than-light drives on several ships. The expedition had been delayed by more than a decade, far longer than originally projected. Many of the original crew members had aged considerably or passed away. New commanders had taken charge. New colonists had been recruited who had no connection to the original mission. When Aurora shared this information with Ember and Crystal, the dragons seemed to contemplate deeply. She felt them processing what it meant that the humans returning were not the same humans who had left. An entire generation had passed. Earth itself might have changed significantly. The humans arriving would have different expectations, different technologies, possibly different values. The dragons took Aurora to a place within the sanctuary that she had never seen before. It was a chamber that seemed to exist at the boundary between solid rock and something else, a space where the properties of reality seemed slightly uncertain. The dragons called it the place of visions, and they explained that this was where they came to see possible futures most clearly. They requested that Aurora enter this chamber with them. They explained that they wanted to show her, with complete clarity, the true consequences of the different choices she could make. The visions she had experienced before had been glimpses and hints. This would be complete and detailed. Aurora was frightened. She had grown accustomed to the dragon's way of sharing thoughts, but she understood that what they were asking her to do was more intense than anything she had experienced before. They were asking her to merge her consciousness with theirs more completely than ever before. But she trusted them, so she agreed. The first vision came rushing at her like a wave. She saw herself remaining in the underground sanctuary. Weeks passed in the vision, then months. She watched from a distance as the human ships landed on Kepler-7. She saw humans establishing a settlement near the old colony on the western continent. They began to expand outward, building structures and extracting resources. The dragons kept their existence hidden, as they had been hidden for 200 years. The underground sanctuary remained undiscovered. Aurora lived with the dragons in peace and safety. The two species coexisted on the same world but never interacting, never knowing each other. But the vision extended into the future. Over decades, the human population grew. They built cities and ports and mining operations. They began to explore the planet more thoroughly. Eventually, the sanctuary was discovered. Scientists arrived to study the ruins. They found the crystal library. They began to understand that the underground world contained signs of an advanced civilization. And then humans began to hunt for the source of the civilization. They followed the tunnels. They brought weapons and equipment designed to either capture or kill whatever might be living in the deep places of the planet. The dragons in this vision scattered, fleeing to ever deeper tunnels, always running. Some were captured. Some were killed in conflicts with humans who did not understand what they were. Within a generation, the dragon species on Kepler-7 was extinct, hunted to extinction by humans who saw them as dangerous primitives or as scientific specimens to be studied. Aurora felt the tragedy of this future deeply. She experienced the loss through the dragon's collective consciousness, felt the weight of an entire species' death. But the vision shifted. Now she saw a different future. In this version, Aurora revealed herself to the returning humans. She showed them what she had become, presented them with evidence of the dragon's existence and intelligence. Some humans were fascinated. Some were terrified. Some wanted to help. Some wanted to exploit the dragons and the planet's resources as quickly as possible. Conflict arose. There were debates in the human command structure about how to handle the discovery. Some colonists wanted the dragons protected. Others wanted them removed. Still others wanted to study them intensively regardless of the dragon's consent. Tensions escalated into violence. Humans attacked the sanctuary, trying to capture dragons for research. The dragons fought back. They used their telepathic abilities and their knowledge of the underground passages to defend themselves. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. The human technology was too advanced. In this vision, Aurora stood between the two sides, trying desperately to broker peace. But she could not convince the humans to see the dragons as equals. She could not convince the dragons to surrender. The conflict spiraled into a war that neither side could win, resulting in destruction and death on both sides. After weeks of fighting, a stalemate emerged. The dragons controlled the deep underground while humans controlled the surface. Neither side could fully defeat the other, but neither could coexist peacefully. Kepler-7 became a planet divided, a world where two intelligent species lived in hostile proximity, always preparing for the next conflict. This future was not as completely tragic as the first, but it was still a failure. It was a future where humans and dragons both suffered, where opportunities for cooperation and learning were lost in the fog of war and misunderstanding. Then a third vision emerged. In this timeline, Aurora descended the mountain with Ember and Crystal as the human ships prepared to land. She went to meet the returning humans as neither purely human nor purely dragon, but as something new. She carried with her the accumulated knowledge of both species. She understood both human nature and dragon nature, could speak both languages, could think in both frameworks. When she revealed herself to the humans, she came not as a survivor seeking rescue, but as an ambassador seeking understanding. She showed them the evidence of the dragon's existence in a way that made the dragons seem like wonders, rather than threats. She explained the catastrophe that had befallen the dragons and why they deserve protection, rather than exploitation. Some humans were skeptical, some were afraid of Aurora herself, uncomfortable with the changes she had undergone, but others recognized the significance of what she represented. They understood that this was a unique opportunity for humanity to interact with an intelligent alien species on terms of mutual respect. Slowly, the human leadership agreed to restrictions on where colonists could settle. Vast regions were designated as dragon territories where humans could not build or mine. Scientific expeditions were organized with the dragons' cooperation, designed to share knowledge rather than exploit it. Over years and decades, a new society emerged on Kepler-7. Human and dragon communities existed in careful balance. Some humans lived in underground settlements alongside dragons. Some dragons chose to spend time in human settlements, learning about human culture and technology. A hybrid civilization developed stronger than either species could create alone. In this version of the future, Aurora lived as a true bridge between worlds. She did not need to choose to be human or dragon because she was both. Her transformation made her perfect for the role of mediating between two worlds that would otherwise have been strangers. The visions faded, and Aurora found herself back in her own body, gasping for breath. She had experienced lifetimes of possibility in what was probably only minutes. Her mind was reeling. Ember and Crystal waited patiently for her to recover. When she was finally able to think clearly, she understood what the dragons had been trying to tell her. She had a choice to make, and that choice, more than anything else, would determine not just her own future, but the future of both species on Kepler-7. The human ships would arrive within days now. Aurora had to decide who she would be when they came. She had to decide whether she would remain hidden, reveal herself, or attempt something else entirely. She had to decide the fate of Kepler-7. Aurora made her decision in the deep silence of the night, alone in her chamber within the sanctuary. She had spent days wrestling with the three possible futures that the dragons had shown her. She had replayed the visions over and over in her mind, trying to find some hidden option, some path that would allow all sides to achieve perfect safety and happiness. But there was no such path. The universe did not work that way. Every choice carried costs. Every possibility involved sacrifice and risk. What mattered was choosing the future that had the greatest potential for positive transformation, for growth, for evolution beyond what either species could achieve alone. She chose the third vision. She chose to become what she had been transformed to be, a bridge between two worlds, a herald of a new age of cooperation. She chose this path not because she was certain it would succeed, but because it was the only choice that honored both her human origins and her dragon present. It was the only future that did not require betraying either part of what she had become. When she told Ember and Crystal of her decision, she felt their relief and their pride. They had guided her to this moment, but they had also trusted her to make the choice. Now they would support her in whatever came next. The dragons began to prepare the sanctuary for a possible human incursion. They gathered the most precious documents from the Crystal Library and moved them to chambers so deep that no human technology could reach them. They identified which knowledge could safely be shared with humans and which knowledge needed to remain protected. More importantly, they began to change how they thought about themselves. For 200 years they had lived as a hidden species, creatures that needed to stay secret to survive. Now they had to reframe their existence as something that could be openly known, that could be studied and understood and integrated into human knowledge. It was a profound shift in their collective consciousness. On the day before the first human ships arrived at Kepler-7, Aurora left the sanctuary. Ember and Crystal walked with her to the mouth of the cave system, to the place where the underground realm met the surface world. Neither dragon displayed emotions, but Aurora could sense their feelings through their mental connection. They were afraid and hopeful at the same time, exactly as she was. When it was time for her to go, the dragons did something that Aurora had never experienced before. They performed what could only be described as a ceremony. They stood facing her with their snouts nearly touching her, and they opened their minds to her completely, sharing not just their current thoughts but their memories of the past centuries, their hopes for the future, their love for her. Aurora felt tears on her cheeks as she received the overwhelming gift of their consciousness. She understood that this was how dragons said goodbye, not with words but with total vulnerability and complete honesty. Then she turned and walked up the mountain toward the colony settlement on the plateau. She walked slowly, allowing time for her body to adjust to the different air pressure on the surface. She walked with her chin high and her eyes clear, a hybrid being moving between two worlds with confidence and purpose. She reached the old station just as the sun was setting. She activated the communication systems one final time. She broadcast a single message across all human frequencies, addressed to the incoming flotilla commander. The message was simple. It said that there was a survivor of the original mission, that there was intelligent native life on Kepler-7, that the commander should prepare the crew for first contact with a civilized species, and it said that the survivor was ready to meet them, to share everything she knew, to help facilitate communication and cooperation. The response came within hours. It was a message from the flotilla commander, a woman named Margaret Reed. She was confused but intrigued. She wanted to meet the survivor as soon as possible. A shuttle would be dispatched to the plateau immediately. As Aurora waited for the shuttle to arrive, she sat at the communication station and recorded her personal log. She documented everything that had happened to her over the past 5 years. She explained the nature of the dragons, their intelligence and sophistication, their desperate need for the human colonists to see them as equals, rather than as resources to exploit. She was not entirely sure the recordings would be believed. She was not certain that humanity would make the right choice, but she had to try. She had been given this chance, this opportunity to serve as a bridge, and she intended to walk across that bridge with absolute conviction. The shuttle arrived as darkness fell completely over Kepler-7. Its landing lights swept across the plateau, illuminating the old station in harsh white beams. Aurora stood in the doorway and waited as the shuttle doors hissed open and humans emerged. The first human she saw was Margaret Reed, a tall woman with gray streaking her dark hair. She moved with the confidence of someone who had commanded ships and directed millions. Behind her came security officers and scientists, all of them staring at Aurora with confusion and shock. Margaret's eyes widened as she took in Aurora's appearance. The changes that 5 years of transformation had brought were unmistakable. Aurora's hair held traces of silver that had not come naturally. Her eyes had taken on an opalescent quality. Her skin held a faint bioluminescence that was visible in the darkness. Her fingernails had hardened into something almost like claws. Margaret approached slowly, studying her carefully. When she spoke, her voice was cautious but not hostile. "You are human," Margaret said, making it a question. "I was," Aurora replied. "I have become something more. My name is Aurora Vale, and I have spent the last 5 years building a relationship with the intelligent native species of this planet. I am here to help facilitate first contact, and I am here to make sure that humanity does the right thing when you learn what lies beneath the soil of Kepler-7. Margaret's expression was unreadable, but her hand unconsciously dropped to the communication device at her belt. She was calling for scientists and linguists, for medical teams and researchers. She was already beginning to understand that this moment was far more significant than a simple rescue. Over the following hours, Aurora told Margaret and her team everything. She explained the plague that had decimated the dragon population. She showed them the historical records she had compiled from the Crystal Library. She shared recordings of dragon telepathic communications, translated through her understanding of both languages. She showed them videos she had recorded of Ember and Crystal, demonstrating the dragon's intelligence and sophistication. She explained the dragon's culture, their art, their philosophy. She made them understand that these were not primitives or animals, but an evolved civilization that had chosen a different path than human expansion and conquest. And finally, she shared the prophecy with them. She showed them the words written in the crystal chamber, the prediction of a guardian who would stand between worlds and choose enlightenment over dominion. She told them that she believed this prophecy was accurate, that this moment represented a genuine choice point in history where humanity could either continue its pattern of exploitation or embrace something new. Margaret was silent for a long time. After Aurora finished her presentation, the commander looked older than she had when she arrived, as if the weight of the decision before her had physically aged her. "If I believe everything you've said," Margaret finally spoke, "if the dragon species is as intelligent and complex as you claim, then the human colony cannot expand freely. There would have to be restrictions, agreements, limitations on resource extraction." "Yes," Aurora confirmed. "But in exchange, humanity gains the knowledge and cooperation of a species that has achieved technological and philosophical heights that your scientists would spend generations studying. You gain the opportunity to be part of something unprecedented, a union of two intelligent species creating a civilization that neither could achieve alone." Margaret nodded slowly. She was beginning to understand what Aurora was offering, what was actually at stake in this conversation. "I need to consult with my command staff," Margaret said, "and the colonists need to be told what we've discovered. This is not a decision I can make alone." "I understand," Aurora replied, "and I have one more thing to show you." She led Margaret and her team back into the mountains. They traveled down into the caves, deeper and deeper into the earth, and finally, they emerged into the crystal chamber where Ember and Crystal waited. The dragons revealed themselves not with aggression, but with grace. They approached slowly, deliberately, in a way designed to seem non-threatening. They demonstrated their intelligence through deliberate actions and clear communication. They showed the humans the crystal library and the ancient ruins. They opened their minds partially to contact with Margaret, allowing the commander to experience genuine telepathic connection for the first time in her life. When the humans emerged back on the surface hours later, they were different. They had touched the minds of an alien species. They had felt the dragon's consciousness and ancient wisdom. They had experienced something that no human before them had ever experienced.